Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited for today's video. We are continuing on in eyeshadow palette week, one of my favorite weeks to do here on my channel, and we do it 4 times a year. And today's video is going to be a little twist off of a video that we have seen done so many times here on YouTube. Usually you see the if I could only choose one, etc. Well, today we're going to be talking about if I had to declutter one eyeshadow palette from brands that I own more than one eyeshadow palette from. Which palette would I declutter out of my collection? I got this idea from Julia Muzacatto. She is truly a favorite here on YouTube. She has very, very creative content over on her channel, and she is incredible when it comes to makeup and just the eyeshadow palette and just the eyeshadow looks that she creates. She's so creative, very well spoken. If you guys haven't checked out her channel, I definitely recommend her, and I will have her link down below, as well as her video about if she had to declutter one eyeshadow palette. So if you guys are interested in hearing about the eyeshadow palettes I would declutter if I had to choose one, then stay tuned. First, if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, I hope that you'll consider doing so before you leave today. I do post a minimum of 4 times a week, and we're posting all week this week for eyeshadow palette week. So if you like eyeshadow palette content, makeup project panning, or if you just think I'm cool, probably not going to be the reason you subscribe. I hope you'll subscribe before moving on, but other than that, let's just jump into the video. Alright you guys, I believe I have 12 brands that I own more than one eyeshadow palette from, and we're going to kick it off with ColourPop. So I actually currently only own 3 ColourPop palettes. So often I'm interested in picking up a ColourPop palette, but I don't know if it's just the fact that I have to order online that just always sways me away from it. But I only have 3 ColourPop palettes, and the palettes that I currently own are the Perception palette. This was in collaboration with Shayla. This is a palette that I really do enjoy using and like having in my collection. You only have 4 neutral shades, so it can be a little bit limiting, but you have so many beautiful shimmer shades, and you have some very interesting colors that you can play around with this. There's a really pretty blue-brown shade. There's also some fun greens and blues throughout, and every time I reach into this palette, I really enjoy the look that I come up with. And then I own the Dream Street palette in collaboration with Kathleen Lights. This truly is just an all-time favorite palette. Spoiler alert, it's not going to be this eyeshadow palette that I declutter. I love this palette because you get your just everyday neutrals out of this, but then you have some fun pops. You have some fun blue shimmer pops, and even this pop of coral. All around, this is just such an easy palette to work with. Even if you are just beginning in makeup or if you are more advanced, I feel like you would enjoy this palette, and I love this one. And then the third palette I own is the Baby Got Peach palette. This is one of their monochromatic palettes. I really do like peach eyeshadow, especially in the spring, summertime. I'm wearing more pinks and corals today. But oh my gosh, I just realized, you guys, Pan has been sneaking up on me left and right, but I just realized I have Pan, but I didn't realize, no, is that Pan or is that a glitter flag? I don't know. No, I think that's just glitter. Never mind. I thought I had Pan in here. I really like this palette. You have the 9 shades. I typically prefer my eyeshadow palettes to be anywhere from 9 to 15 shadows. 9 to 12 and 14 is the sweet spot. So I like that this one is, the 9 pan. It's very easy to travel with when it's in the hard plastic. I like this. You do get the one press glitter, which I've used a few times. Definitely not my favorite, and now I feel like it's messy and kind of getting everywhere. But the foiled shades in here are really foiled, very high performing, and I just love that ColourPop has a really great formula at such an affordable price tag. If I had to choose one eyeshadow palette, you guys obviously know it's coming down to the Perception and the Baby Got Peach palette. Let me just look one more time to make sure I feel confident in my decision. Yeah, I feel like if I had to declutter one, I would declutter the Peach, just because it is the monochromatic palette. I feel like you are most limited in this one. Now that doesn't mean I don't like this palette, but I think if I had to choose one of these 3 to declutter, it would have to be the Baby Got Peach palette. Alright guys, next moving on to Melt. I have 3 palettes from Melt Cosmetics as well. I love Melt Cosmetics as a brand. I just think that they take a lot of time to think through their releases, and their packaging is just so beautiful. The artwork and the creativity behind the brand I just absolutely love. So the 3 palettes that I own from Melt, I do own the Smoke Sessions palette, which the Smoke Sessions I love because the shimmers are just so high impact and beautiful. And I've said in the past that I've regretted, or this was like not the smartest purchase on my behalf, just because it is pretty much an all green palette. This isn't the most everyday wearable friendly palette, but the more that I've gotten to know this palette, the more I appreciate it. I've found some really fun ways to use these shimmers right here, and they are absolutely stunning. You do get 2 mattes in here, but both are really dark green shades, and I do find the matte formula in this palette, and it could just be because they are both darker shades, not my favorite, but still a stunning palette, and I do love reaching into this for the shimmer formula. And then I also own the Gemini palette. This is what this one looks like. Probably my favorite artwork of all of the palettes that I own comes from the Gemini palette. I actually would love to get like this flower, the look of this flower tattooed on me. Now I know this is a controversial palette because a lot of people have had theirs break on them just because the formula is so soft, and then there's been issues with molding within the Gemini palette. I haven't had any issues with my palette specifically. This is what the Gemini palette looks like. I love that you have your green side and then you have your like more neutral tone side. If you guys don't know a ton about astrology, the Gemini, I've done a lot of research in the last year on astrology, and my husband is a Gemini, so I've done a lot of research on the Gemini, and it just fits him to an absolute T. And I feel like I love this palette because it's like there's 2 sides of the palette, and Geminis have like, they're almost like there's 2 sides of them. Like they can be super, super sweet, and then like they can flip in an instant, and there's like a whole nother side to them that's just different. So I think that in terms of like naming the palette and fitting the name of the palette too, I think that this is a stunning palette. The only shade that is not my favorite to work with is actually this shimmer shade down here. I feel like it's just a little bit chunky, and in general the foiled shadows or the shimmer shadows in the Melt line, like the Melt formula for their shimmers, is a little bit chunkier, so bear that in mind if you prefer a smoother formula for your shimmers. But this shade just is not my favorite, which is actually the shade Gemini. And then the 3rd palette I own from them is the newest to my collection. It is the Rust palette, and this is what the Rust palette looks like. The Rust palette is kind of reminiscent, especially like, I feel like the Rust palette is just this half of the palette kind of expanded if you look at the 2. Both are really, really beautiful. I reach into the Rust more than the Gemini just because these tones work better for me from day to day, whereas it's more like half this palette is day to day, but then the other half is like not something I would wear to work. I'm not wearing green shadow to work. I love green shadow, but I'm not wearing it to work. I love both of these palettes. I think both are beautiful. If I had to choose one eyeshadow palette to declutter from Melt Cosmetics, it would pain me, but it would be the Melt Smoke Sessions, just because I feel like these 2 are incredibly more wearable than the Smoke Sessions palettes. And even though I would be really sad to not have these beautiful green shimmers in my collection, I would be more sad to not have these 2 more wearable palettes in my collection. So if I had to declutter one from Melt, it would be the Smoke Sessions palette. Next, moving on to Dominique Cosmetics. I'm going to show you guys my 2 palettes, but if you know me at all, you already know which palette is going to be my declutter choice. So I actually already decluttered the Celestial Storm, I think. Can't remember if it was the Storm or the Thunder that came in BoxyCharm, but the smaller of the 2 that we got in BoxyCharm, I did decide to declutter just because my eyeshadow palette is already like an overwhelming size for me, and I just wasn't getting use out of that. The colors that I did use, I had in other palettes. So I own currently 2 palettes from Dominique Cosmetics. I own the Latte palette and the Rustic Glam palette. I'm still interested in the Berries and Cream palette. That one is still like on my radar, as well as the Latte too. But this is the Latte palette, just a very beautiful palette. Love the color story. It is kind of your everyday basic neutral palette with just a couple pops, but that is what I need 5 days plus out of the week for me. So I am perfectly fine with the neutral palette. And the foil formula in here is very high impact even without a wet brush, so I really appreciate that about that palette. And then I also own the Rustic Glam palette, and if you've heard me speak about this palette on my channel, then you already know that this was a bit of a disappointment to me. I really only use these 4 shadows out of the bottom. Now, I do love this palette for the shade Wanderlust, which is the beautiful shimmery green. You guys know I love a shimmery green shadow, but the rest of the shadows throughout this palette were just kind of a bust for me. Even the shade Fringe right here is just not very pigmented, so it doesn't work that well and it takes a lot of building up. I'm not someone who plays around with blues all that often, so I've only used Evil Eye like 1 or 2 times, and then Dreamcatcher has some glitter running through it and just isn't my favorite. Moonchild is like this deep navy with glitter, not a shadow I'm going to use. Wildflower looks way different on the eyes and blends a little bit patchy, so it just wasn't an impressive shade. And then the purple shimmer shade, not a favorite either. Oh, and then there's this cactus shade as well. I just felt like the formula was really inconsistent and there was a lot of patchy shades in this palette, so you guys obviously can probably guess that the palette that I would declutter if I had to declutter one would be the Rustic Glam. The packaging is beautiful, but unfortunately it's just not nearly as good as the Latte palette. Next, let's move on to Juvia's Place. I currently own 4 eyeshadow palettes from Juvia's Place. In March, I decluttered the Saharan 2 palette because I just wasn't getting use out of that one. So from Juvia's, let's go from smallest to biggest, because as you can tell, I really go up from like a very small palette to a very large palette. So I do own the Nubian Mini, which is this cute little 6-pan eyeshadow palette. I love this palette. It's very easy to work with, very easy to just create a simple everyday look with this. Super easy for traveling as well, just like a really easy compact palette. You're going to get neutral everyday wearable looks out of it. I really enjoy that one. Formula is very consistent with the Juvia's Place formula and performs really, really well. Then I own the Saharan Original still. This is what this one looks like. This palette was very intimidating to me the first 1.5 to 2 years within my collection, but over the last 6 months to a year, I've really come to appreciate and enjoy using this palette. You have some options for some more neutral looks, but then you also have these fun pops of like really vibrant and intense oranges. I love this blue shimmer shade. This shade right here I actually used on like the very outer V of my eye today. And I really enjoy using this palette. I think this one is really, really nice. And I'm happy to have this in my collection. I also own the Deuce palette from Juvia's, and this is a 9-pan eyeshadow palette that looks like a very confusing color story to begin with. But I really like this palette for its shimmers. This shade as well, I really like just as like a neutral transition. If I'm trying to like clean up a look, I really enjoy this shade. I will say I'm not the biggest fan of the rest of the mattes really throughout this palette. Especially this dark brown shade is a little bit hard to blend. But for the shimmers, I really enjoy this palette. I think it's really nice. And then finally, I own the large Magic palette from Juvia's Place. I wish I owned the mini, but I purchased this before the mini was an option. This is what this palette looks like. Again, a lot of really fun pops of color in the shimmers, and it's really the shimmers that steal the show for me in this palette. I'm not reaching into this palette really for the mattes. For me, I know a lot of people really like the deeper blues, blue mattes in this palette. I find them to be a little bit hard to work with. I kind of really just use this as a complementary palette and reach into it for the shimmers, but I do still really like having all of the options that this palette provides. I love this shade specifically right here. I'm like swatching that with the left hand, which I never do, so forgive me if that looked really awkward. Just a really fun duochromatic shade. I think that one is absolutely stunning, and I love to play around with purple shades, and this has like obviously like a purpley shift to it. It's looking a little bit more blue on camera, but it definitely has a purple shift to it. So I really enjoy this one as well from Juvia's, and if I had to choose one to declutter, it was between the Saharan and the Deuce, but I think it would have to be the Deuce that I decluttered, just because this is probably the one I reach into the least out of my collection. Between these two, I feel like I can just get more use out of this. This offers me more, not only in the number of shades, but just the looks that I can think of in my mind to do. So if I had to declutter one from my Juvia's collection, it would be the Deuce palette. Alright guys, moving on to Pat McGrath. I own 3 Pat McGrath palettes, again all different sizes here. So first I own this little mini 6-pan eyeshadow palette. This is what this one looks like. The foils in here are very impactful, but they aren't that like special Pat McGrath formula that has the like dimension to it. It's just like a very intensely foiled shimmer shade. It's a nice palette. Meh. I talked about this one in a regrets video of just this definitely did not need to enter my makeup collection. I did not need that by any means. I mean, I really don't need anything in the makeup realm, but like really didn't need that. Then I own this 6-pan palette. I don't remember if this is something that's still available or if this was just holiday a couple of years ago. You get the 6 shades in this as well, but obviously a lot bigger than the 6-pan palette I just showed you. This palette I really like. It has some of the like more shifty shades in this, and the mattes are really easy to work with. I was a little disappointed in the blue shade in this palette, but aside from that, I like this palette. I do feel like I have to reach into more than just this palette when creating a look typically, but like this shade right here is a really, really cool shade. I don't know how well it's gonna pick up on camera, but just really shifty. Like it looks gold from one angle and then like a blue green from another. And then also this red shade is really unique, and I love that red shade. This is another one where it's like it just hits the light differently and looks so different. So really some cool shades in this palette that I really have fun playing with. I don't reach for this palette as much as I feel like I could or should. And then I also own one of the large 10-pan palettes. This is in, I think Bronze Seduction is the name of it. And this is absolutely beautiful. Again, you have so many fun shifty shades. I love these two here. The like, oh, they're so cool. This green one needs a bit of a base to it if you really want to have fun with it, but good gracious, it's just such a cool shade. I don't reach into that one enough. And then also, for some reason, my hands are so messy now, I find that this gold shimmer shade is such a nice shade when I'm doing a neutral look with like a lighter shimmer shade on the lids, just to like transition or like marry together the shimmer shadow and like the matte shadow. I don't know, I love using it for that. And then this white shade is a really cool, more chunky, glittery shade. I don't know if you'll even be able to see it swatched up there. Yeah, such a cool shade. And then the red, I'm gonna have to go wash my hands after this. The red I also just think is so beautiful. So I paid a pretty penny for this palette. This is obviously not the palette I would declutter. If I had to choose one, I'm sure you guys could already guess, it would be the little 6-pan guy. I just feel like there's really nothing all that special about this palette other than the fact that it's very easy and compact, like easy to travel with, very compact. But like, even if you did travel with this, I feel like you can't get a complete look out of this because you only have these 2 mattes. So I definitely would choose this one to declutter if I had to choose a Pat McGrath palette to declutter from my collection. Next, moving on to Nabla Cosmetics. I own 3 palettes from Nabla. I own their their Secret palette, which is this one right here. I think this has such a fun color story to it. I love that you have like a pinky mauve row, you have this fun row of blues and greens, and then you kind of have a more neutral row at the bottom. I love working with this palette. I always feel very creatively inspired when reaching into this, and spoiler, it wouldn't be this one that I would declutter, but I feel like you guys already know which one I'm going to declutter. I also own the Nabla Dreamy 2, another just absolutely stunning palette, very creative textures throughout this palette. I love working with this one, not the one I would declutter. Then we have the one I would declutter. I really don't enjoy this palette, and this might be actually decluttered in real life from my collection very soon. This is the Poison Garden palette, and this is just not a good formula. Like, this is not Nabla's formula in here. The mattes are very hard to blend and work with, and the shimmers are just really, really lackluster, and I was very disappointed in this palette. I've been trying to make this work, and the one shade that I do enjoy out of this is the shade Narrative. But other than that, I mean, and Narrative is, it's just because it's a nice neutral shadow that works really well for me. Other than that, this is nothing special. Would not recommend this. Definitely the Nabla palette I would choose to declutter if I had to choose one. Okay, camera battery died if I'm like in an adjusted position. Alright guys, next up is Dose of Colors, and I own 5 palettes from Dose of Colors, 4 of them being their 5-pan matte palettes. I love these. They're very easy, again, to travel with, or just, they're nice, easy, compact, very easy to use. I mean, you're obviously limited in the looks that you can create as you only have 5 matte eyeshadows, but I still love these. And then I also own the Friendcation palette, which is truly one of my favorite palettes in my entire collection. You can do so much with this palette. This is definitely not the palette I would choose, but I do own that one. And if I had to choose one palette to declutter from Dose of Colors, it was going to be between my Blushing Berries and Marvelous Mauves palettes, just because I definitely get the most use out of Friendcation and then these 2 5-pan palettes. I actually have Sassy Siennas on my eyes today with the Huda Neon Obsessions palette, and I like the way that my look turned out. But I decided that I would choose the Blushing Berries palette if I had to choose one to declutter, just because I'm going to, or I usually reach into berry tones less than I do mauves. I like all of these palettes, like I said, so it's not like I want to get rid of the Blushing Berries, but if I had to choose, it would go to the Blushing Berries to declutter. I own both Persona palettes, and if you guys watched my If I Could Only Choose One, then you probably know which palette I'm going to declutter between the Identity 1 and Identity 2. And if I had to choose one to declutter, I would be so sad because I love the Persona eyeshadow formula and I love both palettes, but I would declutter the Persona Identity 2 just because this one just speaks to my everyday makeup more than this one does. You obviously get more color with, I don't know why I'm holding this one upside down. You obviously get more color with the Identity 2, but I just love the tones of the Identity 1. You have some warms, you have some cools, and the shimmers, the shimmer formula in the Identity 1, I've said it many times on my channel, is one of the best shimmer formulas I have ever tried. It's so smooth, but yet so high impact. You do not need a wet brush, and you are gonna get like a wham bam shimmer. Let me show you my favorite in this palette is this shade right here, which is Bombshell. This is truly such a smooth formula. This is what it looks like, and this one, it's like a satin sort of taupe, but has like a hint of green, and you guys know I love my green shimmer formula, and this is just like enough to keep you guessing on whether or not, like, is it a green shimmer or what. Like, it's such a cool shade. I love this palette. I love both of these palettes, but if I had to choose one to declutter, it would be the Identity 2. Alright, you guys, Natasha Denona is a doozy. I own a lot of Natasha Denona. I own 5 of the mini 5-pan palettes. I own the gold palette. I own the retro. I own the mini star. I own the mini glam, and then I also own mini nude. And then I own 2 of the $129 palettes. I own Lila as well as the gold. This is what the gold palette looks like. You guys know I love this palette. Just like my perfect palette. It's like all neutral browns and then some pops of shimmery greens. And you have the pops of blue, which I don't reach for that often, but it's got those greens for me. The Lila palette was my first Natasha Denona palette, so this holds a very, very special place in my heart. And then it just has some really, really, really beautiful and well formulated shimmers, some pretty duochromes, and just some shadows that have dimension that you don't get from your standard like foiled formula. So I really do love the Lila palette as well. And then finally, I also own the $65 palettes, or one of the $65 palettes from Natasha Denona. This is the Sunrise palette, and this is what this looks like. Such a beautiful palette, especially for this time of year. Just like a beautiful, rich coral, almost like corally pink palette. This actually reminds me a little bit of the Natasha Denona Neon Obsessions, but not as neon. And this is just a stunning palette as well. Very beautiful. Love the shimmers in here specifically, but the mattes are very easy to work with as well. So if I had to choose one palette from my Natasha Denona collection to declutter, I would declutter the Mini Star palette, even though this has 2 eyeshadow pans in it currently. It's just not a great formula for the most part within this. I love this neutral brown shade. It's one of like the perfect neutrals for me within my collection, but the green and blue shimmer formula in this palette are just not great. And I don't know if it's because my palette is older, but the darker brown matte shade is just not blending like I feel like I used to remember it blend. And yeah, if I was without this palette, I really wouldn't be devastated. So I would definitely choose the Mini Star if I had to choose one from Natasha Denona to declutter. Like, this is going to be an incredibly long video. From Urban Decay, I own 2 palettes. I have the Naked Reloaded, which is a really nice neutral palette, very neutral color story. And then I also own the Born to Run palette, which I love. I absolutely adore this palette. You get so many options for warm neutral looks, which I love, but then you have pops of color too that are really easy to work with. I will say there are some dud shades in this palette. Hellride, not the best, and I found that I had trouble with Big Sky in the way that it wore off. It just doesn't last very long. I created a look using Hellride and Big Sky, and then it got like really muddied, so that was a bummer, but I love the majority of the shades within this palette. Such a beautiful palette, which obviously means if I had to declutter one, I would declutter the Naked Reloaded. I mean, I can just get all of these shades elsewhere throughout my collection, and I really found that quite a few of these shades just weren't that great. Specifically, Angel Fire is a very, very chunky shade. And then I just wasn't really all that impressed with this palette. I thought I was really going to love it. It's very easy for me to reach for work appropriate looks. So from that aspect, I like that it's an easy palette to work with for those everyday neutral looks. But it's nothing special in my opinion. So I would definitely keep this and declutter the Naked Reloaded. From Too Faced, I feel like I'm missing a palette, and I'm going to finish filming this and be like, oh yeah, I also have this palette. But I think I have the Sweet Peach palette. I don't feel like getting up to grab that. I hope you guys don't mind. So I have the Too Faced Sweet Peach palette. I have the Too Faced Palm Spring Dreams palette, which looks like this. And then recently I have acquired the Too Faced Natural Matte palette. This came in my BoxyCharm. Can I open this? There we go. This is what this one looks like. Really beautiful, just a neutral, cool toned look. I can't remember what I said. If I said I could only keep one, I think it was this one. Meaning if I had to declutter one, my answer is still pretty much going to be the same because I would keep this. I would declutter the Sweet Peach palette. That palette was great back in the day when I didn't have an extensive eyeshadow palette collection, but I just feel like formulas have come a long way since then, and I really only keep that palette around for the shade Luscious, which is such a beautiful shimmer. And while I would be sad to be without that shade within my collection, I feel like I'd survive. So if I had to declutter one, I would declutter the Too Faced Sweet Peach palette. I have 3 Tarte palettes, and this is a tough one, you guys, because I truly love all 3 of these. So I have the Tarte Unleashed palette, which looks like this. I love this palette. It smells so good. You have your mauve tone row, which I really, really love, and then you have neutral shades, and then you just have some really beautiful shimmers. I say this all the time, the only true dud shade in this palette for me was the shade Hawkward, which is a bummer because it's like the kind of green blue shade. But I love this palette. I was really impressed with this. My Tartelette in Bloom is just an OG staple palette. It's like, my packaging is like creaky, and I really probably, if I wanted to keep this palette in my collection, I should probably just replace it at this point because I feel like my formula, I can tell, has gotten very dry. But this was like one of the first high-end eyeshadow palettes I've purchased, so it just has a really special place in my heart. As you can see, I have a ton of pan running throughout this, and I just love the Tarte Lit and Bloom. And then I also have the Tarte Love, Trust, and Fairy Dust palette. Now mine is messy because a couple of my shades have cracked a little bit. I've dropped this palette a couple of times, but I love this palette as well. This Frolic shade has huge pan in it. I really enjoy that shade. And then you just have some really, really beautiful mauve mattes in here, as well as beautiful mauve and pink shimmers. And I think this is an absolutely stunning palette as well. However, if I had to choose one to declutter, I would declutter this one just because I reach for those other two just a little bit more than this. Again, I would be very sad to have this without me, or have this not be in my collection anymore. This was limited edition, so you can't get this anymore, and I really do love this, especially if I want a mauve toned look. But the Tarte Unleashed palette also has a mauve tone row in it. Ugh, I don't know why I'm like feeling like this is so hard, because I'm not actually getting rid of this. But if I had to declutter one, it would be this one, but I would be really sad about it. Alright, and then to wrap it up, you guys, I have Huda Beauty and ABH left, both of which I have 10, I think 10, possibly more than 10 eyeshadow palettes in each. I'm not going to show you each of the like 9 or 10 within each brand, because this video is already going to be very, very long, but I'm just going to show you the palette that I have decided to declutter from each of them. From Huda Beauty, I actually have decluttered 2 palettes already from my collection throughout its lifetime, the Emerald Obsession palette as well as the Amethyst Obsession palette. I felt like the gemstone line just wasn't consistent with what I knew the Huda Beauty formula to be, so I decluttered both of those. But I do own all 6 of her original Huda Obsessions palettes, as well as the Neon Orange Obsessions and the medium as well as the rich Nude Obsessions palettes. And then I also own the larger Mercury Retrograde palette. And if I had to choose one palette from Huda Beauty to declutter, I had to choose my Electric Obsessions palette. And I love this palette. I still reach into this palette from time to time, especially if I'm doing a colorful look, obviously, because it's like a mini rainbow palette. But this is definitely the Huda palette in my collection that gets the least amount of love. So I have other colorful shades in my makeup collection I could reach for if I needed one of these shades, and this would be the one I would declutter. I still love this palette. I really do. It's like perfect if you are more of a neutral loving person but want just a mini rainbow palette in your collection. I always think that this is a great option, but this would be the one I would choose to declutter if I had to declutter one. And then for ABH, it came down to either my Prism palette or my Subculture palette. These two are the most difficult, in my opinion, to work with. I own Modern Renaissance, Soft Glam, Subculture, Prism, ABH Mario, Amrizi, Carly, Jackie, Norvina. 9? Maybe I only own 9. Am I missing one? Not sure. But it came down to these 2. Let me open them both up for you. So here is the Prism palette, and then here is Subculture. And I originally thought I was going to declutter Subculture, and then I was like, wait, I need to look at my Prism palette. So then I opened this up, and I was like, oh, I should probably declutter Prism. And then I was like, but wait, I feel like Prism has a few more shades that are easier for me to work with than the Subculture. But in the end, I have finally made the decision that if I had to declutter one, I would declutter the Prism palette. This is the one that I reach for the least out of my entire collection, and even though both are difficult to work with, and honestly this one has more shades that I could easily reach for, like Pyramid, Sphinx, Eternal, even Lucid and Dimension, or like Unity and Parallel. I just really appreciate this color story, and I just don't feel like I could be without this controversial palette. So if I had to choose, I wouldn't want to, because for the most part, I wouldn't say I'm like an ABH collector anymore, but I own quite a few, and I don't want to declutter any of them because I feel like it's like a collector's item at this point. But if I had to choose, I would declutter the Prism palette from ABH. And after that, you guys, whew, Whew, that was a doozy of a video. That is it for today's video, talking about an eyeshadow palette from each of the brands that I own more than one eyeshadow palette from that I would declutter if I had to choose to declutter one. That's a mouthful. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what are some palettes in your collection you would declutter from specific brands. I would love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for sticking around for another day of palette week and for supporting my channel as you guys always do. I will see you in tomorrow's video, guys. Bye.